Hey everyone! Great to be back with you all again. Now that we've carved our way through the first Splatterhouse, it's time to talk about the second. Unlike the original, which began in the arcades, this one would immediately go to home consoles, the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive to be exact. Reception of it would be mixed, with some claiming it to feel like more of the same without enough to really distinguish it from the rest, while others believed it to be the best in the entire series. So that begs the question, how does it hold up now? We'll pick up those 2x4s and we'll see just how well Splatterhouse 2 for the Sega Genesis holds up today. Developed by Now Production and published by Namco in 1992 for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, Splatterhouse 2 was a gory side-scrolling beat-em-up action game, and the sequel to 1988's original Splatterhouse, picking up just 3 months after the events of the first game. With feelings of guilt over failing to save Jennifer, Rick is haunted by nightmares of both her and the Terror Mask. The mask, now reformed, despite breaking at the end of the first game, comes back to Rick and tells him of a secret house, which can be used to save Jennifer from her fate. "She doesn't have to die, Rick," he says. The mask urges Rick to use its power once again and reach the house so Jennifer can be saved from the underworld, and the nightmares can finally end. Translation issues would cause some players in the US to get confused about the locations in this game. The line, "go back to the house," would have some believing that you were going back to the West Mansion once again. But in actuality, the first stage contains the destroyed remains of said mansion in the background. No, this is a hidden house, and Rick's going to have to fight through even more hordes of the undead to get to it. Before putting out this direct sequel, Now Production would develop a spin-off title for the Famicom called Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti, which I'll be covering in another video. The game was vastly different from the original. Instead of dark and gory, it was a light and silly parody game, despite keeping a few of the same themes. Imagine my surprise to find out that this company would go on to make the direct sequel to the original Splatterhouse, just a few years later. Despite the change in development, the gameplay here remains faithful to the original. In fact, it's exactly the same as the original. Just like before, Rick moves left and right across a 2D plane, with the ability to punch, kick, jump, and perform jump and slide kicks if you know how. And just like before, you do get the chance to pick up weapons off the ground occasionally. Some are the same as before, but there's a few new ones as well, including a chainsaw. I was surprised to see just how much like the first game this one really was, considering the change in development teams. This time the game has a total of 8 stages to go through, with, once again, each one looking vastly different than the one before it. These stages can range from swamplands to dark stone floor basements, and even the gates of hell itself. So are there any major differences between this game and the first besides the new set pieces and enemies? A few, yes. For one thing, the graphics in the game are actually a step up from the original. It's just hard to tell because the color palette that the developers went with was questionable at times. This sequel also somehow manages to be even gorier than the first entry, if that was possible. Just look at the way this boss explodes in your face after defeating it, for example. Yummy! These backgrounds are also nothing to scoff at. These areas with the blinking lights and faces of spirits floating in the distance are simply wild and hard to get out of your head later. Most stages in this game are slightly longer than any stages in the first. This is likely due to the password system and the developers trying to strike some kind of a balance with the player now that they have the ability to stop and take breaks. And I really can't complain, as I do consider this game to be more difficult than the original, which should really tell you something. This entry would pave the way for more cinematic storytelling in the series. Between the cutscenes in the beginning and end of the game, little blurbs from the Terror Mask between stages, and events that happen in real time throughout the game, this was yet another way of making the environments around you feel even more alive, or is it dead, than ever. This entry would also make changes to the way Rick's mask looked, to further distinguish it from the Jason Voorhees-style hockey mask seen in the first game. The US version would have it looking more like a skull, while the Japanese version would give it more of a kabuki-style mask instead. Despite being so much of quote-unquote the same, control and gameplay-wise, there are still, in my opinion, plenty of things to differentiate it from its predecessor and make it feel like more of its own thing. One is that the hit detection in this game feels a little different to me. Maybe it's because some enemies require you to be extremely close to hit them properly, or the fact that jump kicking didn't seem to have as much of an effect for me this time around. Those jumping enemies sure didn't help with my blood pressure either. Unfortunately, I didn't find the sound to be anywhere near as great as the arcade or TurboGrafx 16 versions of the original. Everything feels very small and lackluster by comparison. Luckily, the music is still a lot of fun, and really gets you in the mood to go beat up some undead. There's also more unexpected moments, like this section, where a giant squid is chasing you across a small bridge, while other enemies come up to stop you in your tracks and make you part of the squid's next meal. Another surprise was the ghosts in this sequence, making the buttons on your gamepad work backwards, just to throw you off or try to make you fall into the pits below. And of course, the biggest difference of all is this game's story and plot direction, following stage 6 and onward. Once again, it's time to talk spoilers. Just like in the first game, the 6th stage takes place in one area, forcing you to start it up from the beginning if you mess up, and is more of an endurance test than anything else. Here you arrive at the gate to the underworld, in which you're immediately greeted by the spirit of Jennifer. But of course, nothing is ever that easy. The stage is like one big survival mission, where you have to take on waves of hands and floating heads. Hey, what's that thing that just flew away? No time to worry about that now, it's on to stage 7. After fighting a few more waves of enemies, you begin to go after Jennifer, slowly chipping away at a crystal that appears to be holding her captive. After finally breaking her free, you're done. Just kidding. Now you're running through a huge wave of other spirits in the background with this lateralis-looking thing chasing you down. Okay, that's the end of the stage. Phew, one more to go. How bad can it be? Turns out, this is not only the hardest stage of the game, but arguably one of the hardest of the entire franchise. First you start out coming back up the elevator you came in, with Jennifer, punching out some more undead, while debris comes falling down at you from above. After escaping, it's a high-speed boat chase as the squid from before comes back to face you one more time. Here you have to catch its spikes by punching them as they're about to hit, picking them up, and tossing them right back into that thing's eyeball. After it's finally had enough, you and Jennifer make it to the next island safely. So, that giant thing that flew out of the underworld portal before? Yeah, it's back, and it's the game's final boss. This thing's got demons popping out of every which direction, making you have to deflect at least a few of them before you can get a good punch in. After that, it's a flip between dodging what looks like wolf heads and more human heads, before getting a shot to strike the thing. After a few more hits, it turns into one more form, some sort of bat-like creature that moves fast as hell. I pretty much had to nervously flail around to hit it with my punches. And finally, it goes down and we get the game's ending. A surprisingly happy ending, considering everything that led up to this point. You could argue that this ending removes the tragedy of the first game, but at the same time, I think a lot of us were just happy to actually rescue Jennifer this time too. I mean, hasn't this poor woman suffered enough? That said, your feelings on these endings will really come down to preference here, of course. I'll admit, my initial reaction to this game was one of skepticism. Realizing it was going to look, play, and feel almost exactly like the first one did worry me at first. But the further into the game I went, the more I realized that this entry managed to improve on a lot of things too. What the game lacks in 80s horror movie references, it more than makes up for with some really grotesque imagery and memorable enemy encounters. Would I put it above the original? Perhaps not, as flaws like the hit detection, color palette, and sound issues I mentioned before do hold it back a bit. With that said, I still think it deserves a lot more praise than it generally gets. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this may be the most underrated title in the entire franchise. The reactions to it remind me of the way people used to underrate the movie Predator 2, until many years later when fans started to appreciate it more for what it actually was, instead of what it was not. As a side note, I'm also starting to find this whole dynamic of Rick simply punching and kicking his way through everything to be pretty hilarious overall. I mean, we're talking about the underworld itself, and the guy barely even picks up a single weapon to handle it. This unholy creature from the pits of hell? Punch it in the face! Floating head from another dimension? Give him a low kick. Who needs weapons when I've got so much rage? I don't know, it certainly makes me laugh to think about. Flaws aside, I still think this one is well worth playing if you enjoyed the original. Not only did the graphics bring this franchise to another level, but the addition of little cutscenes here and there, and a wild new set of stages and boss fights really did make this one stand out in its own unique ways. Just remember what you're getting yourself into though. The password system may help you keep your place, but this is not one for the faint of heart or patience. You will die. A lot. And you will replay the same stages. A lot. If you're up for the challenge, then I think you'll also find this one to be well worth your time. Give it a try, if you dare. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played this game before yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're feeling generous, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where awesome people like Brandon, Erica, Cielo, and Jonathan all help to keep this channel going. Stay tuned for next week, where we'll be taking a look back at Splatterhouse 3, and the formula for that game is a little different than the one we've seen up until this point. Hope to see you there. Until then, take care.